Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. This video is about making Regency short stays. I was really in the mood to hand sew some stays, whatever mood that may be, but I wasn't ready to commit to full 18th century style, so these were perfect. And yes, I did say hand sew. These stays didn't come within a meter of my sewing machine. I actually couldn't find a lot of extant evidence of short stays, but they seem to be a popular item with costumers. There's lots of images of reconstructions. There's also a lot of evidence of shorter stays, particularly the transitional stays of the 1790s, so it's not hard to imagine there would be a more Regency version of this shorter model. I found a lot of nice informative articles that I will link down below. Either way, I really like the look of the Regency short stays, and Redthreaded was having a pattern sale at the time, so it was the perfect timing. I have used one of Redthreaded's corset patterns before. It was the Victorian corset pattern and I really enjoyed it. The first step was to print it out and cut out the pieces, taping where needed. For materials, I decided to use this heavy linen I had in stock. I was trying to use only things I already had in my stash. I also had some linen thread and some ribbon, although I ended up not using the ribbon in the end. To cut my pieces out, I pinned the pattern to the linen, making sure the grain lines were correct. I then marked all the notches. I also added half an inch at the side seams, as my mock-up had been a little bit tight. I found a Foundations Revealed article on Regency stays very helpful. I will link it down below. They analysed a lot of extant Regency stays and found that most of them were made out of cotton, not linen. However, because this is what I had in stock, I decided to go ahead with it. I had this feeling that historically stays all used to have 2 layers of linen, so I did the same thing for this, although I don't think it would have been necessary, and it did make sewing things like the gussets a lot more fiddly. So naturally my first step was to baste the 2 layers of linen together across all pattern pieces. I then started working on the gussets. My first step was to mark the seam allowance on the gussets, which is, I believe, 3/8, and then I thread traced it, because when I ironed it, the marking of the pen would disappear. Once the gussets were prepped, I then sewed with a very short stitch along the cutting line, just on the outside of the main front piece. I then had the terrifying step of cutting it. This is the same gusset method that I had used on my Edwardian corset, where you turn the slitted edges inwards by the seam allowance and press really well. Then the gusset is positioned underneath it, basted into place, and then hand sewn into place. I simply top stitched with a backstitch along this edge. This took forever. The 4 layers of linen were very fiddly and very hard on my fingers, which meant I had to do each backstitch individually. Once the gussets were stitched on, I trimmed the seam allowance on the inside and then turned the gusset seam allowance over it, hiding the raw edge underneath, making sort of a flat felled seam. This was then whip stitched into place by hand. I need to stop saying by hand. All of this was done by hand. No machine came near this. To reinforce the point of the gusset, and also to hide some of the uglier bits, I took some silk thread and did a simple satin stitch over those ends. This took a really long time, but it looks really neat. The next step was to tackle the boning channels. I marked the position with my ruler, and then I found that I actually had a 1-inch wide ruler, which would be perfect to mark the bone casings. I marked them across all pieces and then hand sewed them with a backstitch. I also decided to add some cording to these stays, as cording seemed to be very popular in Regency stays but not included in this pattern. I decided to add 3 small rows of cording just underneath the bust. Across all the extents I had researched, this seemed the most common place for cording, and it makes sense because the design of these stays are meant to lift the bust. I decided to sew 3 small channels. I marked them with my pen and then sewed them with a backstitch. I left 4 strands of linen in between each channel. For the cording, I simply used cotton yarn. It's the same I used for my corded petticoat and all other cording I've done on corsets. It's very thin and it works really well. I threaded it through a large needle, which I fed through the channels, and then I pulled it out on the wrong side of the stays, leaving a little tail which I tucked in with some tweezers. The seam allowances are pressed open and towards the back. I then cut one of the sides shorter and fold the other one over, creating a flat felled seam that also works as a boning channel. To finish the top and the bottom edge, I cut bias strips of my linen and sew them together. This is the usual method of making bias tape, but I actually think I could have just overlapped them on the stays and it would have worked fine. Once I had one long bias strip, I pinned it to the stays, right sides facing each other, and sewed it by hand with a backstitch. I tried doing a running stitch for this, thinking I could save my fingers and some time, but it actually ended up looking a lot better with a backstitch. The binding is then ironed upwards and over, and the raw edge tucked under, and then hand sewed by hand with a whip stitch. For the boning, I used synthetic whalebone, which is my favourite. It's basically just really nice thin plastic. You cut the length you need and then you can file down the sharp edges with an emery board, and then put them into place. The stays themselves are very lightly boned. It was time to bind the top edge of the stays. I did the exact same method. The curves around the straps were a bit tricky, but because it was cut on the bias, you just have to pull it until it forms the shape you need. This was also sewn with a backstitch. Nearly everything is sewn with a backstitch. So I've just realised that in my haste to get the binding done, I completely overlooked the whole page of instructions about adding a ribbon to the top front. So you're supposed to have a seam in the bias binding at the front so that there's a little gap and you can feed ribbon through it to adjust. And then the ribbon is sewn up in here. And then you can sort of lace it at the front to keep it tauter, I suppose. Because I've already finished it, I'm not really bothered about that. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to do the eyelets at the back, which is the only thing I've got left to do, and try it on. Oh, and the ones on the straps as well, and try it on. And if I find that the bust could use with that ribbon to draw it through, because this is quite stiff linen, I'm not sure if that's entirely necessary, and my bust isn't very big, so I'm going to try it on first and then decide whether that's something I need to do. And another thing that I realised is that the instructions now say that some of the seams are double boned, which I thought wasn't the case due to the diagram of the boning. But so I'm not sure if that's me misinterpreting the instructions or what. But either way, it's slightly boned and I think that'll be just enough anyway. For the eyelets, I simply marked the placement I needed. There are 4 on each side, and then used an awl perforate the fabric. I then do some loose stitches around the perforation to keep it in shape, and then I densely fill the rest. At this point, I was really digging the whole completely handmade, completely linen vibe that these days we're having, so I decided to also weave the cord that would be used for the shoulder straps in the back. I bought some cotton and linen yarn, and then used the lucette to make lucette cord. I have a tutorial about this coming soon. I really like the outcome. These stays are super comfortable, they're a really easy project and I highly recommend this pattern, and I really like the outcome. Thank you for watching.